This is the Frank C. Bellrose Waterfowl Research Center and the Forbes Biological Station. We're located on the very southwest corner, the southeast corner of Chautauqua National Wildlife Refuge. So if you guys know where that is, we're actually located on Chautauqua property, which is kind of unique for a field station. It's unique for any station. Like he said, we are the oldest inland field station in North America. So there are actually some older field stations out there, but most of them are I guess there's only a few of them, but they are coastal fishery field stations or offshore field stations. So if you don't know where we are, now you do. Feel free to come down and check us out. It's a really unique place with a lot of history and some pretty good views too. I'd be remiss if I didn't start out by talking about a couple of the folks that really started the Waterbird and Waterfowl research program. Frank C. Bellrose. Frank started the aerial surveys that was mentioned before. He is one of the main reasons that we actually still have wood ducks today. So the wood duck box was Frank's brainchild. He started that research and almost single-handedly recovered wood ducks. Frank's also was instrumental in doing some of the early steel versus lead shot studies. And on top of that, he also authored The Ducks, Geese, and Swans of North America, which is kind of required reading for young waterfowl ecologists coming up in university systems, and ecology and management of the wood duck. Steve Havana followed Frank as director of the Forbes Biological Station. Steve is actually still around. He's been retired for a number of years. I think he retired in the early 2000s. But Steve is still around. He's very much involved in local conservation efforts. He likes to poke his head in and make sure we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. Steve also worked on the lead shot studies, among a number of other things over his 30, 40 years with the survey. And he penned the Waterfowl of Illinois book, which kind of covers the tradition and history of waterfowl ecology and waterfowl hunting in the entire state. It's a really, really cool book. This is the staff as it currently sits. The redheaded gentleman is Theron Bradshaw. Immediately to his left is Dr. Ariel Fernier. She's actually the station director now. And then there's Mindy Lowers, Chelsea Cross, who's actually no longer with us. She took a job with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that handsome devil, you already know. And some of you guys may know Andy Gilbert also, who is actually really active in Audubon groups in this area. We're really fortunate. We're really kind of a collegial, collaborative group. We like to hang out, have a good time, and we get to work with about anywhere from 6 to 10 graduate students at a time, and we have any number of seasonal technicians that come through to help us do projects to gain experience while they're working on their degrees. So I wanted to cover a little bit of what we're currently working on or projects that just finished up before I get into some of the rail stuff, which I think was some of the questions that actually you guys had, was some of the rail weird towers and stuff that you guys were seeing down at Banner Marsh and maybe on Umpqua. But I wanted to cover a few things that we've done recently before I get into that, and I'll try to get through these pretty quickly. So what we're probably the most known for is the aerial inventories. It's a really unique data set. There's really not another one like it. This is actually the 75th year of the aerial surveys, and I'm the 5th observer over the whole course of that time. And the other observers, of course, Frank started in 48, and then Ted Crompton followed him, Michelle Horath, who's from Lincoln, and Aaron Yetter, who retired in 2020, and I took over for him. We conduct these surveys in the fall. We do weekly surveys starting in September, and then we'll have about a 2-week break. And then this week was actually the end of our 2-week break, and I flew on Monday. In the springtime, we do roughly 4 to 6, or 6 to 8, depending on the stage of the migration. So sometimes the birds get through so fast that it just doesn't make sense to keep doing them after 5 or 6 surveys. And we're really just looking at an index of abundances. So we're trying to get as good of a number as we possibly can, but there's no way to fly around and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're really counting by 10s, 20s, hundreds, and sometimes thousands, depending on the size. We also do shorebird flights now, which is really unique, and you can tell species, but we don't have enough time to really get at the species level during the flight. So we classify shorebirds as bigs and littles. So anything bigger than a killdeer is a big, and anything smaller than that is a little. And we fly these 6 during the fall, just prior to starting the waterfowl surveys, and then 6 to 8 during the spring. And this is the road map that we cover. So 212 miles of the Illinois River and 214 miles of the Mississippi River in Illinois. And that's what one of our tracks looks like. So a lot of turning, a lot of moving around. It's not for the faint of heart. We also do a ton of diving duck research. We've been doing diving duck work for about 11 years now. We've got a consistent banding program. During the spring, we try to capture and band at least 1,000 lesser scaup every year. And on top of that, we've also done some blood metabolite work, looking at body condition of these birds. We've done diet studies. We've done parasite analysis, looking at trematode infections in these birds, which is becoming a huge issue on the upper pools of the Mississippi River. And we're starting to do a little bit more transmitter work with these birds also. So Cheyenne Beats, who was a master's student with us, is currently a PhD student with us, and she followed up some of our early parasite work. She was trying to determine if these intestinal trematodes have sublethal effects. So if they're affecting the bird's body condition, because they get these things in the spring, but if they're affecting them enough that the birds aren't dying, but they're in such poor body condition that they're not reproducing. And that was a big part of what she's doing, or what she did for her master's work, and what she's continuing to do with her PhD work at Northern Illinois University. And so this is some of that transmitter work that I talked about a second ago. For dabbling ducks, you can strap a backpack to them and put a small transmitter on their back and call it good. As long as it's not too heavy, that bird's going to recover well, and it's going to do its thing, and you get great data from it. Can't really do that with diving ducks because they dive to feed, and they just do not handle backpacks well. In fact, most of them die when you put a backpack on them. So you have to surgically implant these things, and we hired a veterinarian to come over, whose sole job is actually to travel around and do this. He works for the USGS, and he did some lesser scaup implants for us, and that's what the bird looks like after the implant. And these are some of our spring movements of those birds, and those birds were actually marked back in not this past spring, but the one before. So really cool data set, really fun method of research to play around with. Currently, we're doing a similar thing using similar transmitters with mallards and green-winged teal, but we're doing this to monitor birds during the fall migration and how they respond to hunting pressure on the landscape. We actually sat on a rocket net this morning to try to catch some birds to put these transmitters on them. And so we're using automated recording units, which you guys may be familiar with, that record bird sounds and gets a good estimate of presence or absence, population density, and that sort of thing for songbirds. It's historically what these units have been used for. We're using them to monitor gunshots and try to get an idea of how many gunshots are on the ground, and try to create somewhat of a thunderstorm map to look at hunting pressure intensity and see if that changes the way that the birds move around the landscape. These transmitters are really cool. I can get into the details of them later, but they operate on a cell phone network, and they just upload the data pretty much as often as we tell them to. They'll take a waypoint, hold it internally, and then they operate on a cell phone network to upload that data, and we can get right on the control user panel and download them online. We just wrapped up a study with five other kind of upper Midwest states and 2 Canada provinces using the same transmitters, but looking at movements of birds in urban environments. So mallards that you would see in a park setting or in close to a city environment versus birds that would nest in the prairie. So birds that would nest on Emiquon or out in Banner Marsh or Chautauqua or something like that. And so we're starting to find some really cool differences in those birds. A lot of the more urban birds have a stronger genetic background of say farm released birds or game farm mallards versus the more wild strain birds. And for the most part, the birds that have somewhat of a game farm genetic makeup don't seem to migrate. They seem to kind of hang out and just do their thing, while the birds that are almost 100% genetically wild tend to migrate more readily. We're also looking at Canada geese and antimicrobial resistance. So this is another grad student, Nicole Petrucci. She's a grad student over at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's collecting poop samples from Canada geese and to see if they're a potential source of antimicrobial resistance. And so as things like chronic wasting disease and bird flu and all these other zoonotic diseases that can pass from animals to humans, this is a project that's trying to get out on the leading edge of that and see if we can kind of start making headway on things that might occur before they actually occur. And Nicole's done a great job the last 2 years with us. This is a wood duck study that we finished up a couple years ago, but we're just publishing the data now. But this is a VHF transmitter, so this is a transmitter that we actually have to go out with antennas and track. But it's a really unique, I wanted to put it in here because it's a really unique attachment method. It's called a bib, and we just hook it over the bird's head, and it just rests at the chest. And it's a really non-invasive method, although it does look kind of invasive, stretching the bird's head. But it's a really non-invasive method to get a transmitter on bird that's really solid and stays there, and we don't have to worry about impacting the bird's actual movements at all. And this is just kind of a animation to show those birds' movements. So once they found a couple of places they liked, they really just went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And spoiler alert, wood ducks like wooded wetlands, but they also like emergent wetlands. So we found a lot of birds in lotus beds. So where the leaf was much higher than the water. That was a high percentage of our locations occurred in those, and we found them in cattail marshes and stuff a little bit more than we maybe thought we would. We also use some of those cell phone transmitters or those GSM transmitters that I talked about on wood ducks. So we couldn't put as many of those out because they are pretty expensive, but we were able to get about 60 of them out over the course of the 3 years of this study. And what we found was the birds were hanging out until the end of October, which is kind of what we predicted. We predicted they would leave middle to end of October, but we did have some hang around until middle of December, end of December, when we had lots of ice on, and I was not prepared for that. But they do make fast, long distance moves. They don't really just kind of gradually go down. Once they leave, they're going fast. So the average migration distance was 262 miles. And we actually had a bird leave from Kilburn, Illinois, which is just outside of Havana, and make it to Texarkana, Texas, which is about 540, 550 miles in just under 12 hours. It's a pretty significant movement. We do a lot of monitoring for the Emequon Preserve. So when the Nature Conservancy bought that property, it was a unique opportunity for us and the Illinois River Biological Station, which is kind of the fisheries version of us, to monitor what's going on immediately starting at restoration and through hopefully perpetuity. And so we get to do some really cool monitoring, and that's what it used to look like, and this is what it's looked like over the years. But we do things like vegetation maps. The aerial survey, of course, covers that portion. We monitor some of the soil characteristics. We monitor food production for migrating and wintering waterfowl. And we do some nesting marsh bird studies out there, some nest selection, nest survival studies out there. And that's a good opportunity for us to get undergraduates involved. So folks that are just trying to get their foot in the door and get experience to start doing some of the stuff that we do. So that's what we've been doing. I think some of the interest was in the Sora and Virginia Rail study, and this is Chad Kramer. He's currently a master's student that most of this work right here that I'll talk about is done by. We've been trapping and monitoring rails for, I think this would be the 4th year at Emequon, Banner, Chautauqua, and I think even the Dixon Refuge up here. I won't get too in the details of this. You guys probably all are aware that Sora and Virginia Rail are pretty small, secretive birds. They call them secretive birds for a reason. They're hard to detect. so it makes them incredibly hard to study. They're a species of least concern, but their conservation statuses are assigned in certain states. But they're such a poorly studied critter that they really warrant our consideration. And so we've made a massive effort to start putting transmitters on, and the technology is actually getting good enough now to where we can actually track these birds with some pretty good consistency. And so migration is the most stressful portion of any bird's annual cycle, but especially a bird like Sora and Virginia Rail. Quality stopover sites. So where we are, we're responsible for providing stopover food, so energy for these birds to make their migration all the way down or all the way up, whichever one they happen to be doing. This study was actually conducted during the spring. And there are potential carryover effects for almost every species of birds. If they don't fuel up enough at these stopover sites, that's going to affect them on the breeding grounds. So they might not be as successful on the breeding grounds if they're not getting the energy they need at these mid-migration states, places that they stop. So rails need more study. There hasn't been a ton of work like the work that we're doing. Nicole did some movement and habitat use in Ohio during the breeding season, which is kind of what this study is looking at. What we're most interested in is whether or not there's elliptical migration that's happening. So are these birds coming and going the same path during the fall and spring? Is there some migratory connectivity? And we wanted to look at large-scale movements and what they're actually doing here during their stopover. So are these birds hanging out for a long time? Because that can be, if they're hanging out for too long, that can be indicative that they're not getting enough. But if they're not hanging out at all, then that can also be indicative that it's a poor stopover site. And what factors are actually influencing their leaving? So is it wind? Is it any sort of weather metric that you can come up with? Or is it just because they're not finding food and they're getting out of here? So we conducted the bulk of this work at the Emiquon Preserve in Banner Marsh. I'm sure everyone in here is familiar with those two places. They're pretty hot spots in our birding community. Trapping, we started trapping in early to mid-March, depending on the year. Over the course of this project, we're pretty proud that we banded almost 560 rails, which is pretty cool. 162 Sora and 395 Virginia Rail. And this is what our traps look like. So it's a little tough to tell here, but this box is kind of a big box that looks somewhat like a clover leaf from the top. There's a solar panel connected to an internal battery, which is connected to a MP4 player that plays calls every so often. I think these are actually set on 15-minute intervals. And so it just kind of entices the birds to come and look for, who's over here. It's breeding season. They're going to do what breeders do. And hopefully they'll find their way in through one of these paths in this thing here. So if you guys can see that, find their way into that trap, wander around trying to find a way out, walk up this and fall into our catch box. At which point we go and grab them and band them and put transmitters on them. This is kind of, don't get too caught up with the ins and outs of this, but we couldn't say how many, because we had to close traps during certain portions of the year and we had to close traps that were broken, we kind of standardized our trapping by using traps per unit effort. So it's just a measure of the traps or the birds captured per day. And we're using that as a measure of the state of the migration, if you will. So 2021, which is in red, which is it's a pretty standard year, typical spring for us in Central Illinois, if you guys recall. 2022 was a little bit of a delayed spring. And 2023, we got some early captures, and then it turned off cold, and we didn't catch anything for a week and a half, almost 2 weeks. And then we started catching them again, and they all kind of ended up in this mid-May departure date time. So a pretty good look at how, when peak migration event probably is in Central Illinois, but two, when birds are showing up and when they're leaving. So we captured and banded 570 some birds, but we only had money to buy so many transmitters, but we were able to get out a pretty good sample size. We put 188 of these little doohickeys here. It's called a leg loop harness, and it's exactly what it says it is. So it goes around the bird's leg. It sits right up on their back because, as you guys know, rails and Sora and Virginia rails stand upright. And so that antenna is poking back, or that antenna is sticking straight up, which in the dense cattail marsh is pretty important. These things last a little over a year, about 13 months actually, and they operate on the MODIS network. So they're all on the same frequency, which can be detected by these big towers that you guys see. But each transmitter has a unique pulse, and that's how we identify which bird is which, because each bird gets a tag that has a different pulse. This is just an estimate of that stopover duration that we were talking about earlier. So, and this is across years, it was pretty consistent. I mean, we had some outliers up here, but for the most part, this is the minimum number of stopover days, and this is the year. But for the most part, we averaged about 9 to 14 days of the birds getting here, being tagged, and then leaving. So actually pretty good. I'll get into what that might tell us in a minute. But we also wanted to look at when these birds were leaving, and almost wholesale across the board, except for 4 or 5 outliers, our birds left within 90 minutes of civil twilight. So they were making that decision super fast. As soon as the sun went down, they were doing what we think are these sampling flights, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then determining really quick whether or not it was the right conditions for them to move out of our area. And so rails were departing on clear nights, so we came up with this metric that we called the moon score, and it basically was just the phase of the moon and cloud cover combined. And what we figured out is birds were picking these really, really clear, really bright nights to depart. They were also selecting nights where the wind was in their favor, which is what birds do. They wait on, in this case, they wait on south winds to move. But they were also doing this really cool thing where we noticed their activity would increase at night, especially around times when they were departing. And so what we think is happening is they were going up and doing these sampling flights and sampling the environment to decide whether or not those conditions were met, and then leaving. It's something that we presume happens, but it hasn't really been, I guess, observed before is the right word. Obviously, during the daytime, there was a negative relationship with rain. So when it's raining, the birds sit tight. They're not really doing anything. And as the day increased, Sora, but not really Virginia, seemed to start moving around a little bit more. So Virginia rail's activity was kind of consistent throughout the day, but Sora, for whatever reason, as the day progressed, they just tended to move around a ton more later in the day. This is what that network of MODIS towers in our country looks like. And so the takeaway here is how well covered this portion of our country is. This is our detections from our Sora tags so far. And we really only had one over in this area. That tells me that our birds are probably all going to the prairies. If any of our birds were moving over here, there's a greater chance of being detected over here than over here, because there's a ton of towers over here. So for the most part, we think these birds are making really quick movements up here, pretty much all sitting on the prairies. And these are the Sora rails. And I'm sorry, the green is during the spring, and these orange lines are our detections during the fall. Same thing, but for Virginia rail, we didn't have any actually move over to the Great Lakes or over to the Northeast. They all tended to go to this prairie, the prairie pothole region. And then we had a small number of birds stick around and then move back south. I mean, not stick around, but make quick movements down to the upper southeast region of the U.S. And then this guy, I don't know what he was thinking, but he was hanging out in Kansas. He made this trip in a day, hung out in Kansas for a number of days, and then just immediately right down here. It was a really cool detection. So to sum that all up, so we think what's happening is our rail migration is peaking in that mid to late April time period. Stopover duration is about 9 to 14 days, which tells us that we've got pretty good food here. We're meeting that fuel need for them, hopefully. Departures are occurring about 90 minutes after civil twilight, so the birds are getting up, making that decision to go and going. We talked about the moon score. Birds like to leave on clear nights. They like to leave with the wind at their back, just like all other species of birds do. The majority of our detections right now are occurring in kind of northwest central Illinois. So the birds that are leaving during the spring and moving up, that's our hot spot. That's where we're getting the most hits right now. There's some indications that migratory pathways are different in the spring and the fall. So if you remember, that was one of the questions that we were hoping to answer. We just don't really have enough data right now to say whether or not that's a thing. And for the most part, right now, we're hoping to get more of those detections, especially on that fall migration. Chad's last field season was this past year, and we're hoping to add to that fall migration detection, and hopefully to impact the wetland management for rails and look at key stopover locations. So not just our area, but where are these birds stopping over during the fall? And if they are stopping over here during the fall, where are they using the same places? Are they going back? Are they going back to where they were successful in the spring? And are there any migratory connections between the fall and spring migration?
What elevation do they migrate to? Have you identified any birds avoiding airports or flight paths?
So it's tough to say with this. I'm sorry. So the question is, what elevation do they migrate, and have we identified any birds avoiding airports or migratory paths? So it's tough to say with these transmitters whether or not, actually to answer either one of those questions, but these transmitters, we're getting a detection when they leave from our towers, and we're not getting anything else unless they're detected by someone else's towers. And so there's no continuity of that line from them going from one place to the next to tell us whether or not that they're avoiding certain areas or selecting certain areas. And the next question is, do they avoid wind turbines? Similar answer there. There's really no way to tell that from the data that we've collected so far. My guess is no, because most species of birds right now are unfortunately susceptible to wind turbines, some more than others, but that's not a question that we can answer from me. Yeah, so the question is about the window collision in Chicago. Yeah, so that's pretty common, unfortunately. It's not an uncommon event. I think that was just a few days ago, right? And it was mostly McCormick sparrow, that's right, yeah. I just saw the article with a picture of a bunch of dead birds. Unfortunately, that's something that happens. I mean, not to that scale, but that's pretty typical. And there are ways to mitigate that. There's been a ton of research done. There's a whole book done on how to avoid window collisions in birds. And there's stickers that you can buy. There's a number of different things that the Audubon Society actually has multiple articles written about ways to mitigate window collisions. So the question is, there's been, you're certainly not the first, but there's been multiple people who, because we play those callback surveys, and that's a method used, it's ubiquitous. People throughout the country use these marsh bird protocols to try to determine density and population sizes of marsh birds, presence, absence, that sort of thing. And the question is, was there any discussion with Cornell and to look at the eBird data to see if those detections spiked during that time? And we certainly haven't had that conversation. We've discussed it in the past about whether or not that's a thing. I don't know. Quite honestly, I don't know if Cornell's ever looked at that. But
are there efforts to require window manufacturers to embed bird deterrents?
So the question is there any push or any efforts to require window manufacturers to mitigate some of these window collisions? Certainly there's people trying to do that. I don't know how successful they've been. Obviously not very, because it's not a thing. But I do know that several groups have done so, not necessarily on a large scale and not necessarily collective, like a large scale collective group enough to really make headway. But there has been groups that have pushed for that. Well, thanks everybody for inviting me. I hope you guys got something out of it. I always enjoy.
Thank you very much for a very enjoyable evening. So
appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Josh.